I probably love it more than anyone else I know. I love everything about Christmas, and I mean everything. Do I have to be stuck here, or can I like walk around? Because I know we just put this up here, but is it good for me to walk? Can you guys hear me? Is it okay if I walk around? So I really love Christmas. I love Christmas more than anybody else I know. I love the gifts. I love the presents. I know it's like taboo to say in church, but I love presents. That's a part of it. My birthday is around Christmas. That some people says that kind of dampens your birthday because you don't get as many presents. But I still love it. The other thing that I love about Christmas is I love the bigness of it. I love the fact that everywhere you go, you see lights. You hear the sounds of Christmas. You experience the smells of Christmas, the cinnamon, the cooking. It's massive. And I know, I totally get it. A lot of times in church we recognize that there is the consumer-driven industry that's behind much of what we see. I don't want to talk about it. That's worthy to have a discussion about. But the fact that Christmas is so big in everybody's eyes, and I recognize that what I'm celebrating when it comes to Christmas is the first advent of Christ, is absolutely fantastic, and I love every bit of it. What I'm afraid of is that sometimes as Christians, our understanding of what actually took place in the birth of Christ is much smaller than it ought to be. And that we end up criticizing the bigness of what we see within the world because we're reacting against the sinful inclinations of a fallen society. And while we go ahead and diminish the bigness of what we see in the world, at least in part, we seem to diminish the greatness of the advent of the coming of the birth of Christ. And so I'm really excited to be here because I get to talk about my favorite subject, which it's Christmas, but it's maybe a subject that we don't actually hear talked about or preached about during Christmas. My favorite subject in all of the scriptures is war. I used to believe that everything in the scriptures, the central motif, the central theme, the central idea found within the scriptures was war. And it was my favorite subject, and any chance I had, I would sit there and talk about our God, who is the holy warrior who comes to destroy our adversaries. So this morning, as we come to talk about Advent, and as we talk a little bit about Luke chapter 2, I'm also going to talk a little bit about Matthew chapter 2. The topic and the subject I'm going to be speaking about is the warring baby that was born on Christmas morning.
Right.
Now, one of the problems I think that we encounter as Christians, especially when we're thinking about Christmas, has to do, and I know I just praised the bigness of Christmas, but part of the problem with the bigness of Christmas within our culture is sometimes we get more influenced by our culture and our cultural inclinations in terms of what Christmas is actually thought to be, as opposed to actually being shaped by the Scriptures and what the Scriptures actually say took place at the birth of Christ. And so every single year in my classes, I have this 30-question Christmas quiz that comes from the Scripture, that comes from the Scriptures. It's just a 30-question Christmas quiz. And what's remarkable about this is most of the students that I teach have grown up in church. They've heard the Christmas story a gazillion times. I know they've heard it because before I give the quiz, I'll teach on the Christmas narratives, the advents of Matthew and Luke, and they know it, you would think. But every year, all of them fail. Because we're so influenced by things outside of the Scriptures. Like, let me give you some examples. In fact, Mike and I were at breakfast earlier this week, and I was talking to him about some of the questions on this quiz. I'll give you a good one. One of my favorite hymns, Christmas hymns of all time, hands down, without a question, is "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." We sung it this morning. It was like, this is such a great coming to the church to hear my favorite Christmas hymn sung. So here's the question. When did the angels sing at Christ's birth? Do you remember? I want you to think about this. When did the angels sing at Christ's birth? they don't sin. They don't sin. No, they might. It might be wrapped up in the word praising God, because we just read, right? A multitude of angels, the heavenly host appeared, praising God, saying, glory to God in the highest, peace on earth. There's only two places in the scriptures that mention the singing of the angels. One's in Job, which is before the creation of the earth. And the other time is in Revelation, when they're singing after the redemption of all things takes place. Yeah, that's not to say they don't sing. I'm not trying to over-speculate, but it's interesting about how something so simple gets so quickly overlooked. Right? Or maybe something less significant. Do you remember which book? Or even better, do you remember what the innkeeper said to Mary and Joseph? Do you remember what the innkeeper said? I mean, think about this. You're probably scrolling your mind. There is no room in here, or there is no place. But there's a problem. The scriptures, the innkeeper doesn't say a word. Why doesn't the innkeeper say a word? Because there is no innkeeper mentioned anywhere in the scriptures. Right? I mean, but yet we embrace this narrative, thinking that these things are true. And we get so wrapped up in these details that we're so certain are part of the scriptures that we actually miss the scriptures. And what I want to put out before you, at least this morning, before I go any further, is that perhaps what the scriptures are trying to tell us in both birth narratives, both here in Luke chapter 2 and in Matthew chapter 2, is that when we come to look at the first advent or the first coming of Christ, what we're not looking at is necessarily a sweet event that has to do with a meek and mild baby that's born that we can pinch his cheeks and say how cute and how wonderful this is. Perhaps what the scriptures are actually saying in these birth narratives, I'm going to actually go a little bit further. What the scriptures are saying in these birth narratives isn't that we're just recognizing the cute baby Jesus, which I'm sure he was cute. We're not looking at that, but what we're actually looking at is the advent of the great king who's coming to defeat and destroy his enemies. And so this is going to be the sum total of what I'm going to talk about. That Jesus, in the manger, is God incarnate, who at that time, while he's a little baby, dependent upon his mother, is, yes, both upholding this universe and keeping your cells held together, and the one that was anticipated to come and wipe out all the enemies and destroy them violently. Merry Christmas. Now, why would I say that? Well, there's a lot of clues that are left here in Luke chapter 2, and then again I'll move over to Matthew 2 in just a few minutes. A lot of clues that are here that we just aren't aware of because we're separated by several, a couple thousand years. I mean, notice how Luke 2 begins, right? Like, who is it that summons Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem? It's Caesar Augustus, right? Now, do you understand that Caesar, okay, I'm a history teacher, so I'm going to get into a little bit of the history to kind of shape this out for you. Rome had been in civil war for nearly 100 years. And what happened 25 or so years prior to the birth narrative of Christ was Caesar Augustus' victory over the Senate, his defeat of Mark Antony's armies, and the establishment of what we know as the Pax Romana, or what we call the Peace of Rome. Essentially what happened is when you get to that first century BC, as Rome is beginning to fall apart, they've got both internal and external problems. They're dealing with political, social, economic issues across the board. People are fighting for power. And in the midst of this struggle, you have overthrows of one king or one ruler after another. They didn't have a king at this time, it was ruled under a republic. But ultimately what you end up seeing is the rise of Caesar Augustus, the defeat of Pompey and Crassus dying. And you see him declaring himself to be the dictator for life over Rome. He becomes this exalted figure who is now in complete and absolute control over the Roman Empire. The people are celebrating him, but the Senate sees him as a threat to the Roman Republic. And so you have the assassination of Julius Caesar. After Julius Caesar is assassinated, what you end up having is, within Caesar's will, he actually adopts Octavius, who becomes Caesar Augustus, to be his own child. And because of these adoption papers, Caesar Augustus, Octavian, takes over his military and leads a revolt against the Senate, who's now come up against his adopted father. And he defeats them side by side with Mark Antony. Right? It's the history that takes place. The problem is that Mark Antony happens to be married to Caesar Augustus' wife and then falls in love with Cleopatra down in Egypt. So Mark Antony goes to Egypt, and Caesar Augustus says, this isn't right. And so Caesar Augustus wages war against Mark Antony. There's some other things that take place here. And he wins this victory. And once he wins this victory against Mark Antony's armies, for the first time in 100 years, you now have a Roman peace. This is the context. And we know that when Caesar Augustus calls for the census from historical records, that what he's actually doing here is he's holding a census so he can count the people, because he's wanting to go ahead and a lot of people don't know this about Caesar Augustus. He was actually concerned about the families of Rome, that there was a disjointedness in terms of the fidelity of families. And he was seeking to bring about a census to tax those who weren't faithful to their spouses, to actually reform the marriage and family units so he could establish a greater sense of peace all over the Roman Empire. Like, right? But again, these things we don't talk about, but this is what's happening. Caesar Augustus has seized control. He's now wanting to establish some sense of moral authority over the people. He's calling upon the census so that he can know who to tax and who not, at least on a higher level, to maintain certain kind of control. And this is how our birth narrative of Christ's birth narrative begins in Luke chapter 2. A couple of other things you need to know about Caesar Augustus to understand the background here. One of the things that Caesar Augustus did is once he declared himself to be the emperor, what he called the victorious general, as he called it, he declared Julius Caesar to be divine and took on the title the Son of God. And you know what one of his king titles, you guys know what king titles are, like kings will take all of these titles. If you look up, if you type in Queen Elizabeth of England, like you'll get this Google search and you'll have all of these titles, pages of just titles that Queen Elizabeth has. Kings like to accumulate titles. One of the titles that was actually given to Caesar Augustus by Virgil in the Aeneid was God Most High. Now, let's put this in context. What then happens here? Well, and I know that Lee was here just a little while ago. He preached on Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. A couple of things just to comment about 1 to 8 without getting into it. The emphasis here on 1 to 8 is here you have Mary and Joseph. Joseph being of the line of David, the kingly line of the anticipated Messiah coming from the very beginnings of the Scriptures. And you've got this emphasis. The king, coming from the line of Judah. This is why they're going to Bethlehem. Not because David's from Bethlehem, he's from Nazareth, but because his father, David, is from Bethlehem. And you have this lineage, this kingly lineage that's now coming to the home, if you will. Again, that may be a good way of putting it. And then when they get to Bethlehem, everything shifts from this, we're going to Bethlehem to be taxed, or to go for this registration, for the sense of taxation. And then all of a sudden, it turns its attention to shepherds. A lot can be said about shepherds. Again, I'm not going to emphasize this, but we know that the shepherds were actually those who guarded the livestock and the well-being of Israel. We know that they were fairly lowly people. They were outcasts. Again, a lot can be said about that. But here's what the shepherds weren't. The shepherds weren't weaklings. The shepherds weren't people that just cower at the slightest drop of the hat. The shepherds are the ones that not only defend the sheep, but will lay their lives down for these sheep. Because again, this is the livelihood of Israel. If there is a threat, they're the ones, unlike others, who are going to stand up and actually fight it. But I want you to notice what happens here within the text. A single angelic being appears, stands before them. The glory of the Lord is shown around them. It's a reference to the glory cloud of God in the Old Testament. If you remember that pillar cloud of fire that came down and separated out the Egyptians from the nation of Israel in Egypt when they were at the Red Sea. This is the cloud that they followed. This is the one that rested in the Ark of on the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle. Later came into the temple. This glory cloud is shown around them as this angelic being appears. And what do? They fall on their face. They cower. Now, I want to go ahead and start reordering some of our thinking about these kinds of angelic beings. Something that just happened this last week that totally delighted my heart. We had this presentation of a Christmas presentation at Smith Prep, and they had the nativity scene and the manger scene, and the angels appeared, and the angels had swords. I was thrilled about this. Why does this delight my heart? Because part of our problem is we think that angels are somehow some kind of like Tinkerbell fairy-looking beings that flap down and are just kind of prancing around these shepherds, and that this angel that appears is like la 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 la, and then all of a sudden the shepherd's like, oh, I'm really scared. And one of the things I tell my students, I'm like, if that's really the impression of the angels that we give within our pageants, I assure you the shepherds are probably sitting there saying, let's kill it and eat it. Because that's the kind of people these shepherds. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I really want you to understand that. I want you to capture, though, the essence of what's going on. Yes, the presence of God is there. When the presence of God is there, you fall on your face. I totally understand that, right? God's presence is a very terrifying reality that needs to sink into our being. But what the text is emphasizing is the appearing of this particular angel who carries with him the presence of God. It's whatever it is that this angel's message is, and whatever this angel is having to communicate to these shepherds, is terrifying. And I want to posit before you that the reason it's terrifying is because he is the first of the heavenly host. One of the questions on the quiz that I pass out to my students is, what is a heavenly host? And there's a list of things. Somebody, would like answer A is angels selling, serving tea and crumpets. An angelic choir. Do you know when we talk about an angelic host, we're talking about an army. This is an angelic army that is appearing. And here's what's so remarkable about it. What's the deal with the first one arriving? Well, typically when you had a major defeat that took place in Rome, the winning army, they would fight to be the first to make the announcement of the victory that has just occurred. And so you have these runners that would take off. Typically, the first runner that gets there is one of the mightiest, most fierce warriors, because not only did they survive the battle, but they're now the one that can actually outrun and outpace everybody else to home. What we're probably talking about, it's a little bit of speculation, but I think it's rooted within the text when you're talking about this angelic army that appears, is you're probably talking about an angel that actually shows up and looks much, not like a fairy or some kind of butterfly, but you're probably talking about an angel that is appearing wrapped in battle garb, ready to do war. And they look upon this angelic being, and they're not seeing just any kind of picture in front of them. They're looking at one who can destroy them. And you tether that picture together with the presence of God, and you have something truly terrifying. And you can almost get a sense at this point of why the angel says, don't be afraid. I bring good tidings of great joy. Right? My presence here isn't the presence of judgment. At least not yet. Yeah. But the angel's saying, my presence here is to announce a victory. Not just any kind of victory, but a victory on the cosmic level. Something that you've never seen before, and something you'll never see again. This event is bigger than anything you can imagine. Get up. Listen. Right? And then all of a sudden, appearing with this angel is this angelic army. You have the universe cracking open, and you have the armies of God marching in from his heavenly kingdom and his heavenly throne into the earth to stand before them. And what do they say? Glory to God in the highest. Peace on earth. With whom he's pleased. We'll come to that here in a second. But here's the picture I want you to get. You know Caesar Augustus? Glory to the God in the highest. Not this Caesar. Not this one. Peace on earth among men. You know about this Roman peace. We're not talking about a Roman peace. We're talking about a cosmic one. You understand that Caesar Augustus brought in peace through the armies of Caesar Augustus. Now God is establishing his peace through the armies of heaven. And here we stand as a testament that real peace is coming. Real peace is here. And it's not for everybody. Because what does it say? Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth with whom he is pleased. This announcement may be great joy for the shepherds, but it's not great joy for the rest of the world. Just as Caesar Augustus had decimated the armies of the Senate, just as Caesar Augustus had decimated the armies of Mark Antony, now Christ, this child who commands these armies, are coming in to rescue his people and decimate his enemies and theirs. This is the picture. This is what we've got to get our minds wrapped around. This isn't just an announcement of, this is cute. This is an announcement with the angelic army saying, all heaven is broken in. Peace to those who belong to God, to the rest to hell with them. That's the weight. That's the force of this text, and we miss it so often. I don't want you to miss it. Now, here's the other thing. I don't want you to think that this is me just making this up from this text, or that this is just one text where we have other texts saying something different. You can go ahead and look to, and I'm not going to read it because we're a little short on time, but I'm going to read some other passages here in a minute. But go back to Matthew 2. Remember the Magi? So I grew up in the church. And I was that kid that made Sunday school teachers' lives miserable. I'm a little bit of a cynic now. I was definitely a cynic then. And when I go to Sunday school and I would read these stories, one of the and I'm sure none of you have done like this is how I am. How in the heck do the Magi know that Jesus is going to be born? Have you ever just thought about this? These were the questions I was asking when I was little. Okay, so these magi in the east who are astrologers and astronomers are looking at the stars, and all of a sudden they see a star. I'm like, I get it. Right? The king of the Jews is going to be born. Let's follow the star. I mean, where do you get that? You understand that question? Like, what? Why do we just so quickly accept it? And for me, I was always like, this is just kind of silly. Until I recognized some things about the text. Now, I'm going to speculate again, but I think it's good contextual speculation. Where would these wise men? Oh, and by the way, the other questions that I asked on the quiz. You know how many wise men there were? At least 2. That's all we know. Even though it was wise men in the plural, there's at least 2. There was actually probably a caravan of 100 or more. But nevertheless. Again, we're so influenced by but Where do these wise men get this idea? Well, we don't really know. And I want to be at least fair with that. We don't actually know. But here's what we do know. We do know that there was a figure in the Old Testament, and there is a book in the Old Testament that is written in the language of those in the East, and the person who wrote it happened to be appointed the head of all Magi. Do you know who that is? It's Daniel. Daniel, while in exile, is actually appointed by Darius to be the head of all Magi. And Daniel, the first 2 chapters of Daniel are written in Hebrew. The last 2 chapters of Daniel are written in Hebrew. Everything else is written in Aramaic. They probably had it. And they probably had these stories that we're telling them, going down the story. It's a very good and strong assumption to make. Again, we don't know for certain, but I think it's a good bet. If that's the case, and I think it is, I want you to turn with me to Daniel chapter 7. Now, while you're turning to Daniel chapter 7, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want to tell you kind of how this is broken up. Daniel 7 is broken up into 2 pieces here. Chapter 7, verses 1 all the way to verse 1 all the way through chapter 14 is Daniel's dream or vision. The rest of the chapter is the interpretation of that vision. Okay? And it's likely they had this text. And if they had this text, I just kind of want to walk through this a little bit so you can get the idea of why it is the Magi were coming to worship this one. It starts out very, very interesting. Look in Daniel chapter 7, verse 2. Listen to what it says. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven and earth, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. It's really important for me to start with this idea of sea. We don't normally think of very biblical imagery too frequently. But this vision that Daniel has begins with him standing on the seashore, and he sees this sea, the winds of the sea. He sees this chaos. Now, a couple of things I want to point out about this. We know from the ancient Near East that the concept of sea is wrapped up into the entire cosmology or cosmogony of the people. Here's what I mean by that. Okay, that's a fancy word. I apologize. Here's what I mean by that. Throughout the ancient Near East, the sea is seen as evil. That's what I mean by that. For example, we see Baal, right? We read about Baal. Generic. Baal, in the Ugaritic myth, struggles against Yam. So Baal and Yam fight each other. Okay? Yam is the Ugaritic word for sea. And the reason they worship Baal is because Baal has overcome the sea and continually fights the sea because the sea is evil. Now, it's not just here. You can also look at Mesopotamian mythology. There's another, and hold on, because I'm going to show you, this is steeped in the biblical text here too. I want you to get the idea of this pulling stuff over here. There's this other myth that's called the Enuma Elish. And this is your Mesopotamian myth of creation. And the way the Enuma Elish is you have these olden gods who are living out, in their godlike world. And all of a sudden, Tiamat, who is another god, the goddess of the sea, creates these massive sea monsters that emerge out of the sea. And these golden olden gods, they call Marduk, who is going to be the mighty warrior to fight Tiamat and destroy these sea monsters. And you have this massive battle that ensues, and you see these sea monsters destroyed. Marduk takes Tiamat's body and fashions her into the world. Okay, you can go through one myth after another myth after another myth. The point I'm trying to get at is all over the ancient Near East, and especially where Daniel is writing, this is a very prominent understanding of the sea. But it's not just here in the ancient Near East. Turn with me and keep your finger in Daniel 7, so I want to come back. Turn with me to Psalm chapter 18. Psalm 18. Throughout the scriptures, you see the psalmists, you see the prophets talking about the chaos and the evil of this scene. And we'll start here in Psalm 18, verse 15. It says, "Then the channels of the sea were seen." The idea is all of a sudden the sea is cleared away and you can actually, see its abyss. The channels of the sea were seen. The foundations of the world were laid bare. At your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. He sent from on high and took me, and he drew me out of the many waters. You can go through this, but again, the point here is what you're seeing is when you see this idea of chaos and turmoil, it's identified with the raging sea waters, and it's God who comes and rescues us out of that chaotic mess that can destroy you. And actually, if you continue to read throughout Psalm 18, you get that picture. But you get other pictures too. Let me just go ahead and mention some. You see God's actions towards the sea. I'll give you the passages. You can look it up later. Jeremiah 5:22 and Job 7:12, for example, talk about how God has actually built the earth, the sand, the shores, to guard and protect the people against the sea. As though the sea is this really evil, vile, violent thing. And what God has done in his grace and in his mercy is established the lands to ensure the safeties of his people. You see other usages. Isaiah 19:5 or Isaiah 52 or Ezekiel 30:12 or Nahum 1:4, Psalm 18:16 like we just read. We talk about God drying up the land or drying up the sea to give land to his people. You see other places. Habakkuk 3:15 talks about God treading upon the waters. As the waters comes up to fight, God levels it down and treads on it. You see other passages, and I'll turn here. This is I think a really good one. Isaiah 27:1. What it says here in Isaiah 27:1. And I promise you, this has to do with the birth of Jesus. Isaiah 27:1. Listen to this. It says, "In that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan." I should probably go ahead and tell you that, remember how I was telling you about Baal fighting Yom? Remember that? I was just mentioning that. Yom has his henchmen. His henchmen are sea monsters, and one of them is called the Leviathan. Just putting that out there for you. But anyway, it says, "A strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, the twisted serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea." Right? And again, you have more images like this just over and over and over again as God wages war against these gods and against the forces of this world. Think about this even. Genesis chapter 1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. To do what? To speak creation into existence. Right? The picture you have here, even in Genesis chapter 1, is as God speaks the world into existence, he's bringing from this chaotic, dark, deep world order and structure, that he establishes his kingdom as he treads upon this chaos and evil. However you want to look at it, this is all wrapped in. And what you see here in Daniel chapter 7 is he begins and he says, "I'm standing on the shore of this chaotic water." You guys get that picture? I should also probably mention this too, just a side note, because it would be sad if I didn't. This is one of the reasons why the narrative of Christ calming the storms on the water, walking through it, becomes quite significant. It's not that he's just the master over weather. He's the master over all gods and all chaotic order in this world. It's also why when you see in Revelation, when Christ returns again, what happens to the sea? It becomes glass. Right? I mean, don't miss this imagery. This is beautiful. And what Daniel says, he says, "I'm standing there and I'm looking out and I see this chaos and this wickedness." And then as he pulls out of this Daniel chapter 7, you see these four beasts that emerge. Now, the beasts are really weird here, but it would have been really offensive and really vile for anybody reading this, because these beasts, especially the first one, the second one, is really messed up, combining like multiple animals together. In one sense, what you have here is a declaration of the perversion of these things that are coming out of the sea, because it's not after the order and pattern of God's created order. This is clear. The Bible says he created things out of its own kind, and then all of a sudden you don't have that single kind. The readers of this would look at this at horror and terrified, and they look at these beasts, these perverted things that are coming out. And we ask ourselves the question, what are these things, right? Daniel tells us in verse 17, he says, these are the four nations, blah, blah, blah. Now, what those four nations are, we can debate those. It can be also, at least two or three options. My point is, what you have here is this depiction of these perverted, nasty, villainous beasts that represent the kingdoms of this world that are emerging out of the sea of chaos, that are waging war against the rest of the world. That's Daniel's vision. That's the first half of the first part of the vision. The second half, and this is what I want to read to you. Listen to what it says. And the second half starts in verse 9. This isn't the interpretation. This is just the second half of the dream, the vision. So you've got the one with the beast and the nasty things coming out. And then all of a sudden it says this. Look at verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and his hair on his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. The picture you get here, first off, is you've got this perverted, beastly world of chaos and wickedness. And now you have this thing that we might want to call like the chain of beings. The second part of his vision is now we have God in his glory depicted in the human realm. The realm and the way things were supposed to be. Okay? That's the picture. And he depicts God as this man, this wise man, who's sitting on his throne, and he depicts the throne as a burning chariot. Right? That this God, he sees these beasts coming out, and they're mocking the people of God. They're mocking God and the thrones and the kingdoms of heaven. And all of a sudden, you have God who appears sitting on a throne like a judge, and his throne happens to be a war chariot of fire. That's the picture. And then it says this, verse 10. A stream of fire issued and came out before him. 1,000,000 served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. And I looked then, because the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, the great words that the horn was speaking is making reference to one of the horns of one of the beasts that came out that was mocking everyone. And this is what it says. It says, I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Then it says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven. There came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, and glory, and a kingdom, and all the peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. The Ancient of Days is clearly divine. But what do we make about this one like the Son of Man? As you're aware, this was Jesus' favorite title for himself. He is the Son of Man. This is where he gets it. This is the text that Christ is always appealing to when he says, it's the Son of Man. Well, who? It's this one, right here. Well, what's so fantastic about this description is that it's not just described as the Son of Man, he is described as the cloud rider. What's significant about the cloud rider? Well, first off, the phrase cloud rider was reserved for Baal. Baal was said to be the rider on the clouds. Let me just quote one ancient Near Eastern text for you. Hearken, O peasant Baal, give heed, O rider of the clouds. You see this over and over and over and over again throughout all the ancient Near East. At the very least, before I touch the biblical narrative, what we're saying is whenever you have this description of cloud rider, we are talking about divinity. Whatever you want to say, we are talking about divinity, and it would have been unmistakable in the ancient Near East. But let me just go ahead and quote some other passages for you so you can actually see that it's not just an ancient Near Eastern thing. Psalm 68:4 says this, "Sing to God, sing praises to his name, extol him who rides on the clouds. His name is Yahweh, and rejoice before him." Or how about this, Psalm 104, 3-4. "He makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. He makes wings his messengers, flames of fire, his servants." It's probable what you actually have here. It's not probable, it's what you do actually have here. Is you have Daniel seeing a vision in which the Ancient of Days is now directly associated with the Son of Man. You have the chariot cloud that's in the sky as Christ is riding the clouds. Let me give you some more. Isaiah 19:1. "See, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. The idols of Egypt tremble before him, and the hearers of the Egyptians melt away." Or Nahum 1:3. "The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is in the whirlwind, and the storm and clouds are the dust of his feet." Again, again and again and again, you have this cloud rider. Just make this subtle point. Mike, you can pick up on this later and just run with it if you want. This is a gift. Why do you think in Acts chapter 1, Christ ascended on a cloud? It wasn't just him disappearing. It's him riding his chariot to destroy the wicked and claim his throne. We don't talk about this ascension in Christ ruling and reigning like we ought. We certainly don't connect it to this lifting up we ought to. Because listen to what it says. "Behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and he was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all the peoples and nations should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." And now go back to the Magi who are reading this text. Why do you think they were there? Because they recognize that this isn't just the King of Israel. This is the King to every tongue, tribe, and nation. And if they don't come and worship him, just like Christ is going to wipe out Herod and everybody else who stands in contrast to his kingdom, he will destroy them too. The entire narrative of Matthew chapter 2, like Luke chapter 2, hinges on this proposition that Jesus Christ is the King that is to be worshipped and adored, not because of sentiment or nostalgia, because this is the one that's going to go ahead and clear out his enemies and rescue his people. Two more passages before I finish. I want you to look at the very last depiction that we have of Jesus, the very last one. Go to Revelation 19. This is the last picture that we have of this Christ child who was being born in this manger. If we see at the announcement of Christ's birth, the angelic armies, God's agents of victory and war, announcing the birth of Christ, because Christ is going to come back and destroy his enemies, or he is actually coming right now to destroy his enemies. Look what you have in Revelation 19. I wish I could spend hours on this. I can't. I'm just going to Verse 11. This is the picture of Christ. Not the Christ we typically talk about, but the one that I think we need to recognize was in the manger. Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped with blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God, the Almighty, and on his robe and on his thigh he has the name written, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. The imagery that is being picked up here in the text is from Isaiah, that when the Messiah comes, he's going to gather up his enemies and throw them into a winery pit, and he's going to squish them between his toes in wrath and fury. And the angels announce, glory to God in the highest, peace among men with whom he is pleased. Turn to Psalm 2. This psalm is called, it's an enthronement psalm. It was a psalm that was read when you had the inauguration of a new king over Israel, or over Judah. I want you to listen very carefully to this. Very carefully. If you followed and you've tracked my argument of these birth narratives, this text becomes perhaps what I would consider the single greatest application that I can give you. As we consider the birth narratives of Christ, this is your application. Psalm 2, the enthronement psalm. Why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against the Anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. You hear that? He who sits in the heaven laughs, right? These kingdoms, these rulers come to make mockery. But yet it's God who is in the heavens. He laughs, verse 4. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. You hear it? The nations make mockery. They seek to rise up and destroy God and his people. And yet God laughs, and he brings one to break these nations like pots. Verse 10. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. You could very well say, Caesar Augustus, be wise. Be warned. Say, Vladimir Putin, be warned. Kim Jong-un, be warned. And dare I say it, Republicans, Democrats, be warned. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son. Let me just remind you that when you kiss a king, remember your posture. You're on your face, and you're kissing his feet. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you punish. Be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. If there is any word that we need to hear this Advent season, if there is any warning, any bit of concern as it relates to this birth narrative of Christ, in all of our celebration, and we should celebrate because this is the King of Kings, this is the Lord of Lords, this is the one that is going to lay low and destroy the enemies. This is the guy this is the incarnate Son of God who has come to completely wipe out the adversary in every way. He's not just coming to do away with your sin. Yes, he's doing away with your sin, but he's completely reversing the curse. And the product of it, all wrong things, all bad things, all evil institutions, all kingdoms will bow down and to submit to this one because he's going to bring about peace. That's worth rejoicing over. That's what we do. But here's the application. Don't forget in humility that you are to be kissing the Son's feet. Because if you don't kiss the Son, you'll perish under his wrath. How do you end on a high note? I want to say Merry Christmas. He's worthy. He's our King. Let's not be trite. Let's not be there's an appropriate disposition and manner that we should treat this time and season with. Not just this time and season. There's a disposition and manner that we ought to be treating Christ with every single day of our life. We don't just come to church because it's just helpful. Okay? It is helpful, and I hope you're encouraged, and I hope that Mike preaches in ways that strengthen you in your life in this world to serve the King. But do you understand what you did this morning by showing up is the most political thing you could ever do? And that is draw a line in the sand and say, I'm coming to the temple to worship my King, despite all others and all other institutions. Let me kiss the King and let everything else perish. Let me pray. Lord, I just ask that you would help us. Help us learn to love you, to serve you, to see you as the warring King who fights for your kingdom and your people. Give us your Spirit that we might be humble enough and recognize that you are a merciful God who has given your life for us, that our sins might be forgiven, and that we might be brought back in